A school shooting in a Detroit suburb becomes a first-of-its-kind criminal case.
School shootings are sadly not new, but the way the teenagers' parents may be held directly responsible, well, that's new.
We're going to be examining the details and to see whether this case is going to set a new standard when it comes to gun control, which is a hotly debated topic here in the US. I'm Yasmine Tanres.
I'm LaBruna. This is Erupt, and we've got issues.
Now, before we do dive into this case, we do really want to pay tribute to the victims. Hannah St. Juliana, 14. She was a freshman and the youngest victim who was killed. She was on the volleyball team and was just about to make a debut on the basketball team the night before she was killed. Madison Baldwin, who was 17 and was expected to graduate this year and had already been accepted to several colleges, some with full scholarships.
Justin Schilling was 17. He was a senior and co-captain of the school's bowling team. He was survived by his two brothers, Nathan and Clay. Tate Meyer, who was 16, he was a junior and a football player at the school, and he wanted to attend college and play football. Meyer reportedly tried to disarm the shooter, and he sadly died in a patrol car on the way to the hospital. The night of the actual shooting, there was already 30,000 signatures on an online petition to change the name of their school's football stadium after Tate. Our thoughts and our prayers are with the families and their victims.
Yes. So let's take it down to what happened prior to the shooting, to the day of the shooting, and thereafter. Lauren, why don't you kick us off with that?
Right, we're going to start with the Monday, right? So it's the Monday before the shooting. The shooter, Ethan Crumbley, was in class, and a teacher noticed that he was actually searching for ammunition online. They called the mother, his parents, they called her and sent her an email. They received no response back, but actually the mother texted him and said, "LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught." So obviously that's creating a lot of issues for her legally. And then the morning of the actual shooting, the suspect's parents were urgently called to the high school. A teacher found a drawing. The illustration showed a semi-automatic handgun with the words, quote, "The thoughts won't stop, help me," and included a drawing of a bullet with the words "blood everywhere" written above it. And also had the words "My life is useless" and "The world is dead" were also written on the drawing. The prosecutor in this case, Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald, actually shared all these details, sort of like a play-by-play live in a press conference, and that's really where all the information was released. School officials that day, once they found the drawing, they brought the parents in. They said, "You have to get counseling for your child within 48 hours. The parents did not want him to be taken out of school that day. No one searched his backpack in which he had the gun, and he was actually able to return to class.
Yeah, so what happened next evidently was entirely shocking. At 12:50, authorities say that's when Ethan Crumbley was roaming around and went to the bathroom and took out the gun from his backpack and then started shooting. And of course, there were a lot of students that were trying to get away. This took around about 4 to 5 minutes that he was still going through the school halls. And then deputies arrived. And when they arrived, he set down the gun, surrendered, and then he was arrested. At around 1:22, this is when news of the shooting started to then go about that something was happening at Oxford High School. And this is when his mother, Jennifer Crumbley, was texting her son, "Ethan, don't do it." At 1:37, his father, James Crumbley, called 911 to report that the weapon he had at his home was missing, and then suggested and thought that perhaps the shooting is due to his son, who had taken his gun then. So law enforcement has then reported then that the gunman had fired around about 30 shots, and he was being charged with terrorism and first-degree murder in the deaths of Tate Meyer, 16, Madison Baldwin, 17, Justin Schilling, 17, and Hannah St. Juliana, 14, and 7 other people were also wounded. Now, it's also been then reported, so this happened on Tuesday, right? And this was last week. Friday morning then, the parents went missing.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is that the prosecutor that I mentioned, Karen McDonald, she did this live press conference, and she actually announced that the parents were going to be facing 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter before they even had the parents in custody.
Yeah. So, okay, they then went missing. Okay, so then on Saturday, the police did receive a tip, and that's when the parents got brought in, and their attorney did justify that they were going to turn themselves in later that day.
Right. And we talked about the prosecutor as well. It's a really, a unique moment here for parents to be charged with involuntary manslaughter, especially 4 counts here. They're being held almost directly responsible according to the charges. And the prosecutor, Miss McDonald, really spoke to the motivation behind why they filed these charges. Let's hear more on what she had to say.
I want to be really clear that these charges are intended to hold the individuals who contributed to this tragedy accountable, and also send a message that gun owners have a responsibility. When they fail to uphold that responsibility, there are serious and criminal consequences. As we work together to honor the lives lost and all of those impacted by the evil acts this week, justice for the victims and their families is at the forefront of today's announcement. We need to do better in this country. We need to say enough is enough. For our kids, our teachers, parents, for all of us in this community and the communities across this nation.
From there, you can see the prosecutor explaining why the parents are going to be facing manslaughter charges.
Joining us now, we have practicing attorney in Michigan, Jamie White. You're there, right, on the grounds, just an hour away as to where this has happened, and you also know a lot of the legal advisors and attorneys who are involved with the case. Tell us, what do you know?
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. This is an incredibly important story. As far as what's going to happen next, so, there's really 3 different cases going on, even though they're all being considered in the same context. The shooter is in a vacuum by himself, and I think he deserves that attention. And then we have mom and dad who, although they're being treated together in large part by the way of the media, in my opinion, they have different levels of culpability. And the evidence is continuing to play out, and public statements are continuing to vet some of this out. But it appears to me, in my opinion, guys, that mom and dad have a different level of culpability. I think they're both in a lot of trouble, but in my opinion, mom, much more so. It appears that she really acknowledged at some point in time that he was trying to get ammunition. I think you referenced that in your opening, and, really encouraged him to lie or not get caught going forward. And I think that's going to be a powerful piece of evidence for the prosecuting attorney. And ultimately, when the shooting started, keep in mind, this is a school that has more than 1,000 students. And when the shooting started, she texted her son and said, "Don't do it." So I think the prosecutor is going to allege, they already have alleged, that, why did you presume it was your son? It's because you had prerequisite knowledge. And I think she finds herself in a real pickle, trying to explain to a jury or a prosecuting attorney as to why she should not be held accountable for these acts. And then, there is the issue. This maybe is not as culpable as the other facts that I've discussed, but, in social media, we have a 15-year-old boy who in the state of Michigan is not allowed to possess a weapon. And, this weapon was purchased by his parents. And, she's on social media, a couple days before the shooting, really celebrating a mother and son day out, shooting whatever, the pumpkins or whatever they were doing. So I think the evidence against her is a little more overwhelming. I think they're both extremely culpable, but I think we have 3 different cases. And as we work through this process, I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Right, and we want to get into sort of all the details that you're discussing there, like why one culpability is more than another, and you kind of shared some of those details. But I think what's shocked so many people, and what we've seen is that legal experts are shocked that both parents are going to be facing 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Obviously, there have been cases in the past where parents are charged when a child has access to a gun and shoots someone else or themselves. They've been charged with child abuse, violating gun laws, and negligent manslaughter. Yet in this case, they're both facing those charges, 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. So you talked to a little bit as well about the prosecution's case so far. So considering the details of what happened that day, you did mention the social media post leading up to the actual shooting when the mother posted Mother and Son Day with his new Christmas present. So how strong do you think the prosecution's case is at this point?
I think it's strong. Michigan, to my chagrin, is we're a gun state. Our governor was almost kidnapped, who's a friend of mine. And we've had people marching through our Capitol with assault weapons, and it's a very frustrating situation for a lot of us here. But if you're ever going to posit a case to hold third parties accountable for the behavior of others, this is it, right? And, by way of analogy, you mentioned some gun laws and that sort of thing. And, Michigan, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of really strong laws that hold people accountable for not securing their weapons and so on. To the contrary, we have, similar to Wisconsin, what we just saw in the Rittenhouse case, we have really excuses for children to have weapons, whether it's hunting and so on and so on. But here, the prosecutor has been savvy. What she has alleged is that she's not alleging anything about guns. She's just saying that you were so reckless in your behavior, or what I would suggest your lack of behavior, that a reasonable person would believe that this could lead to the harm of a human being. And, and that's what we have here when you stack up the facts. And I think, what we're going to see is the prosecutor trying to make a case that, but for the negligence of these parents, would these 4 people be dead? And, you've touched on some of the facts already in your opening, and I've talked about it a little bit, but I think it's a fair presumption. We haven't even gotten into the interaction with the school officials, but I think it's a fair presumption that if these parents would have acted in any reasonable manner that is required by a parent, taking guns and out of it, these kids would be alive. The analogy that I would throw out to you, I think it kind of brings it home, because I think when you start talking guns, especially in Michigan, unfortunately, it narrows the focus. But, think about it in this context. If you had a 15-year-old boy and he's drunk, and you give him the keys to your car and tell him not to tell anybody that you gave him the keys to your car, and you send him out into the community, he gets caught, and you tell him, don't get caught next time, and he continues to drink and drive with that vehicle and kill somebody, I think it's a pretty straightforward case for most reasonable people. Unfortunately, the politics of guns and culture of guns in the state of Michigan, I think is going to blur that picture. But I think if we look at it in a broader picture as to what are our responsibility as parents, what are our responsibility as citizens when we see a 15-year-old boy behaving in the way he behaved, do we give him the tools to effectuate?
So to that point, because I definitely want us to touch upon, some of the state laws in Michigan versus other states. But to that point, with the prosecutors arguing that the parents' role here has to do with negligence, there's also been clearly some issues that the son has had as well in the way in which he's been raised. And in one way or another, he has been sort of encouraged into this path, which has been explicitly sort of seen. What has been the defense's argument so far? And do you think, based on what we know, that the parents will be held legally responsible in the end?
So as far as the parents are concerned, I do believe they're going to be held legally responsible. Now, involuntary manslaughter carries a maximum of 15 years in prison in the state of Michigan. And, you don't ever get the maximum. It doesn't matter, what your situation is. You don't ever get the maximum. Michigan, the best case scenario, or the worst case scenario, depending on what lens you're looking at it through, is 2/3 of the maximum. So the most these people could ever be sentenced to on this charge is 11, 12 years in prison. And I think that's even unlikely. Usually we see a sentence on the 2 to 5 year, maybe even 7-year range for a charge like this. Now with 4 dead kids and multiple others injured and the entire world looking, I suspect that this judge, who I'm familiar with, and this prosecutor, who I'm familiar with, are going to seek the high end of the guidelines, which will, subject these parents to up to 5 to 7 years in prison, potentially more, but I think that's a realistic expectation if they're convicted.
Aside from their child, being prosecuted here too, will this perhaps then, sort of look towards parents more to be liable for what their child would have done by going sort of rogue in this way? And this is not just for, gun control, this is for anything.
So I'm not sure that I understood the question entirely, but was it, what is the liability of the parents?
Yes. And do you think this is something that could set sort of another standard here as well, to hold parents more responsible?
Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely, yeah, I think this is a monumental moment in the state of the law as it pertains to the parents' responsibility for children. And it's unfortunate that it took this kind of situation for it to happen. But I think that, we're going to see scrutiny across the board going forward, and it's not only guns, guys. I mean, if your child is 12, 13, 14 years old in the state of Michigan or wherever you are, and they are not in school, they're selling drugs, and mom and dad are looking the other way and claiming they can't control it, and this young person is in the community creating problems, how do we, stem that, right? I mean, so I've been doing this a long time, and, I can't really count how many times I've been sitting there with parents who are complaining and carrying on that their kid's in trouble, and they're kind of looking the other way because they got picked up and now they have to pay a fine and now they have to take them to classes and counseling. But the reality of it is, if you have a 12 or 13 or 14 or 15-year-old child who is in the community creating mayhem, whose responsibility is that? And this case has really focused in on this issue in the sense that now these people are in jail and they're going to be in there for a while, it appears. And I think that I know this will be, because I've been speaking with people all over the country over the last week, this is going to be the roadmap going forward for prosecutors. Can we hold parents accountable? And I think it's an appropriate and in a realistic way to address these issues that we're dealing with.
We talked about the parents' liability, but what about the school in this situation? If the parents might see some sort of prison time here, couldn't the school be held liable? And I'm saying that based on the information that there was almost 2 days in a row here where the first day on Monday before the shooting, he was Googling ammunition, and then the Tuesday of the actual shooting, they found this illustration, and they let the student return to class. Yeah.
That's a great question. And this is something that I think we're going to be grappling with. I actually received a call from a victim yesterday, and I'm not going to go into details about that, except to say that they have that same question. They want to move forward and find out what the potential liability is associated with the school. So Michigan is a unique jurisdiction in many ways, but as it pertains to this particular case, in Michigan, we have an immunity statute. I can go deep in the weeds if you'd like me to, but what I would suggest to you is that Michigan is one of the only states in the country where if you're a public entity, if you're supported by public funds, whether it's a university, a school, a prison, a public hospital, you literally cannot sue, no matter how egregious the acts are. Now, I know that sounds bizarre, but that is the state of the law in Michigan. It's something that we're dealing with as we speak, even prior to this case, but it is an obstacle to this particular lawsuit. That aside, yeah, I believe the school has significant liability here, because even aside of, I think people can, pick at the decisions that were made along the way. But there's one decision that should have been made, and that is just common sense: call the police. As soon as this information came available to the school district, you don't go to the principal, you call the police. The principal doesn't go to the parent, you call the police. And, had that happened, I believe there would have been some responsible intervention. Oakland County is a wealthy, conservative environment, and I believe that they would have probably taken that young man into custody and searched his belongings. And I believe that the school really dropped the ball in that regard. Now, whether or not they're ultimately held accountable, time will tell, but I certainly think there's some culpability there.
You've mentioned, some of the state laws in Michigan, and so we kind of want to go into that because the 30 states have a law known as the Child Access Prevention Law that requires adults to keep any guns out of reach from children. Now, of course, Michigan doesn't have that law, which you've also already mentioned. Now, do you see this case potentially then motivating lawmakers to change that in Michigan or any other state?
So in Michigan, guys, I have to be honest, I'm not extremely confident this will result in any sort of significant reforms as it pertains to gun laws. I mean, in fact, we have a legislator, and I read it this morning. I can't remember exactly who he was. You can Google it, but who has proposed, I don't know what this impetus of this is, but, in Michigan, you have to be 16 years old before you can legally drop out of school. Not that it's enforced if you're younger, but at the end of the day, that's what the law says. And we have a legislator who proposed this morning a law that says, let's wipe 16 away. Like, you can drop out anytime you want. If your parents don't want you to go to school or you don't want to go to school, good for you. And I think that's consistent with a lot of the attitudes surrounding guns, in the state. It's extremely troubling. But I am not confident this is going to result in any form of legislative change. I think that, again, what we've already discussed, I think the prosecutors around the states, God forbid we have this happen again or anything similar to it. I think they're going to take a look at not only the person who perpetrated the act, but who allowed the act to happen and who could have prevented the act, whether it was a school official, a parent, a guardian, or otherwise. But I'm not confident at all that Michigan is going to undertake any sort of gun reform at this point in time.
In our last question for you here, we obviously talked about the parents, in this case, a great amount with you, just sort of their culpability, but to discuss almost them appearing to be on the run, we discussed that earlier as well. The parents went missing. They found them on Saturday due to a police tip. Their lawyer, Shannon Smith, repeatedly said her clients were not fleeing prosecution and planned to turn themselves in Saturday morning. How, if at all, will this affect their charges?
So it will not have a ton of effect on the charges, I suspect. It is an evidentiary issue. I know Shannon. I've worked with Shannon. We've been on the opposite side of the aisle for several years. In my opinion, in all fairness to the defendants, if they hired her, they probably planned on turning themselves in. It's not unlikely, it's not unheard of, I suppose, that, people will kind of try to take a couple of days and get their affairs in order. I'm not suggesting that's what happened here. I don't know that that's the case or not the case. But I do want to just kind of put out there that it's not unheard of. And I think it would shock me that, I know Shannon, I know how expensive she is. And I think to hire her and run is a little inconsistent with common sense. With that said, if the prosecutor is able to do so, we have in Michigan what's called flight evidence. And when you're looking at, when you can explain to a jury whether somebody's guilty or not guilty, the prosecutor will have the ability to present evidence of flight evidence. Did this person act consistent with somebody who wanted to defend themselves, or did they act guilty? And I suspect that, this evidence that they were hiding in a warehouse, however that ends up being defined, is going to be introduced in that context. And while it will not affect the charges, it certainly will be productive for the prosecutor as they try to present evidence as to why these people are guilty, that they in fact had a state of mind of guilty and acted in that state of mind based on their flight.
Okay. Well, Mr. White, thank you so much for joining us here on Erupt today and really sharing your time and expertise to really breaking down this complex topic here. We thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure, guys. Take care.
Well, we also want to say thank you for joining us of this episode of We've Got Issues. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Erupt's YouTube to follow along with all our YouTube and content from other moderators.
And please don't forget to check us out online as well, erupt.news, as well as all our other social media platforms at Erupt. For Lauren LaBruna and myself here, Yasmine, Tanres, and the entire Erupt team, thank you so much for joining us, and drop on by next time.